So I think we'll go ahead and get started, knowing that we might have a few people join us, and we can always catch them up as we go forward. I particularly put up this first slide here with the ATG Trend Spotting hashtag on it because there is some materials that have been posted on Twitter, actually even going back to May and June of this year as part of this initiative that you couldn't find that way. But we also particularly invite you to tweet along with this session or coming forward in time. So I particularly want to thank our panelists here today, Kiyomi Deards, Athena Hafner, there's a typo, Hafner, and Heather Staines, who will join me in reflecting a little bit about this event and the things that we're doing with it. And also want to thank Katina Stouch, who's, brainchild this is, who last year had worked with Heather Staines and Mark Sandler on a project called the Futures Lab, where that had resulted in an article in the Against the Grain publication around issues of trying to get us to start thinking about the future. And Katina had particularly sort of kept, I think in your mind, if I can channel her, said, she really wanted us to look at trends, and particularly those trends that are impacting us that aren't not just how we're responding, but what are the pressures that are coming in. So really to create a way here at the Charleston conference, but also an ongoing conversation throughout the year around a vision for our community and how we would engage trends and moving forward. So I'm Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe. I work at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I accepted Katina's invitation to try and shepherd this process. And so we've been working together for the past year almost, I guess, to do this with a vision of what it might be to go forward. So the goal of the ATG Trend Spotting Initiative is to establish an ongoing process for identifying social policy, economic, technology, and educational trends, and then forecasting the impacts of those trends on the information industry, with particular attention to scholarly communication, publishing, and academic libraries. And our goal is to take a community-engaged process for doing this cooperatively and collaboratively so that we can have, again, those trends and then forecasting the impacts. And of course, part of forecasting the impacts is also if we don't like some things that we see coming, maybe we would like to try and make some of those changes. So there are a number of deliverables for this project, and I really enjoyed making this slide this morning where I could check off things. We made a vetted listing of some of the trends that are impacting our industry by means of our online trend storm, which is a brainstorming process we did earlier this year. And if you don't have a copy of the handout, it's the blue one that's up here, and I'll pass it out to people who came in late a little bit. We then on Monday held a Trend Lab forum, which is an invitational opportunity for people to come together to discuss these trends and to think about them together as a community. Right now, we are in this very moment doing the Trend Talk panel, which was part of our goal is to take what happens on Monday with an invited group of people thinking carefully together and then be able to engage the larger community in this. So not only here with this Trend Talk panel, but then in the recording and then plans for going forward, which include a set of trend texts. You can see I was having fun naming these things, which is a set of short essays that will look at some of these trends, and we were just talking a few moments ago about how we might publish and disseminate these, with the goal of coming back in spring 2019 to kicking off the process again with people nominating the trends that they're feeling that they'd like to have discussed in some sort of Trend Lab process. And we particularly want to kick that off in spring so that we have a little bit more time to have people engage in that process, participate, and be able to be invited to partake in the Trend Lab here at the Charleston Conference. So there's a leadership group for this process, myself, Katina, Leah Hines, and Tom Gilson. Wow, I have really typo problems here this morning. I'll fix these before we put them online. The advisory panel being the leadership group, plus Mark Sandler, Heather Staines, and Pat Sobadis. And then participants is the community at large. So as I mentioned back in July, which was not so long ago, we had people nominating both ideas for the trend storm as well as nominating participants for the invitational meeting, because we didn't want it to just be the people that Katina and I and Leah could think of on a Friday afternoon. We wanted to put it out for people to say they were interested in participating. We then held that meeting on Monday. It was 2 hours where we had a discussion of the implications of the trends, best and worst case outcomes, and thought a little bit about themes and divergences across the trends. We have a number of people in the room here today, in addition to the panelists, who participated in our Trend Lab on a Monday, which I think was a really intense and invigorating discussion. So today we'll be reporting out from the Trend Lab a little bit and reflecting upon it, pushing ourselves forward, and part of the reason I'm going to mention this trend text again is we'll be soliciting the community at large to participate in writing the trend text. So whether you were there on Monday, whether you filled out the trend storm, there's always a new invitation of an opportunity to come into this process and to bring your thoughts and reflections. Particularly with respect to how fast these trends are coming, how impactful they'll be, and how desirable they'll be. People who participated in this have already heard about this, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page of what is a trend. So a trend is a tendency or a direction of change over time. It can be increasing or decreasing. So some trends are about things going away, some trends are about things coming towards us. Some trends are strong, some are slow, some are speeding up, some are slowing down. So they can really be anything except the status quo. Okay? But we're seeing some sort of change. There's longer definitions that you can find in the literature, and because we all work in the field of publishing and librarianship, we know there's journals on this topic, right? So this is the Journal of Future Studies and an article discussing this idea of trends. Let me just put up a couple examples of the kind of very big picture trends that are out there. Like the number of people enrolled in American higher education declined in fall 2017, and that number has declined steadily for the past 6 years. So we can see very much there that that is a trend. It happened in 2017, and it happened every year since 6 years prior. So that's a very strong trend, which if you work in academia, might start to have you think this could have some real impact for us. There's another trend, which is that in general in civil society, we have the trend of decreasing trust in institutions. And again, this is just an example of an article that was really in-depth exploring this particular trend of less trust. Finally, an example that's maybe a little closer to home is the trend towards analytics technologies. So we see the use of analytics growing across all sectors, and of course we see that in ourselves as well. So as a result of the trend storm, which we did in late summer this year, which is why I want to do it a little earlier next year, there were 9 trends that sort of emerged from the ideas that people submitted on the survey. And these 9 are listed up here, and I'm going to take a pause to pass out the sheets with the full descriptions of the 9 trends to those of you who didn't get one yet. So one moment. So every one of these, oh wait, I gotta go back to the mic so it's being recorded. Every one of these trends has a cute name to try and help us sort of solidify it in our brain, as well as something that was a little bit more descriptive. So we have all about analytics and algorithms, which is about that data, algorithms, and moves from the descriptive to the predictive. Number 2, who really knows anyway? The trend of anti-intellectualism and cynicism. Everything is computational, you call that content, et cetera, et cetera. The people who participated in the Trend Lab were given an opportunity to sort of say which 3 they were most interested in discussing. No one who's filled out the survey was interested in number 5, which is the climate change. I don't know if that's just too overwhelming or felt too distant. The most popular was the researcher's way. This whole idea of really coming to understand the researchers as being in control of their own workflow. So during the Trend Lab, we talked about these questions. How does the trend manifest itself in the information industry? What are the impacts of this trend? And then how would you assess the speed, impact, and desirability? And then challenging ourselves, what is the best case scenario for this trend and what is the worst case scenario? The white sheet of paper that I handed to you is also the Trend Lab questions. And also your opportunity, if you're interested today, to turn in your thoughts relative to any of the trends and to even volunteer to write one of the trend text essays. So I've given you the 2 handouts that we had at the Trend Lab. So what I'm going to do now is turn it to the folks who have been waiting very patiently here, all of whom were participants in our Trend Lab, to talk a little bit about their experience. And so I'm going to kick it off by asking each of them to share that as you think about the trends that we discussed at the Trend Lab, what was the most significant insight you gained from this conversation? Did you decide who's going first?
Apparently it's me. So I don't know if this is the most significant thing, but I feel that this impacts everything that we were talking about. I was in the group that was talking about the common good dissolves, the defunding and eroding of support for public goods. And this is like a really important topic, and we better talk about it again next year, because it's a huge problem. But when we were talking about this and why this was happening, we started talking a bit about administrators and people in high positions. And it used to be like someone got in a position and they were kind of there for the rest of their life until they retired. Like very rarely did people change institutions. But now administrators change where they're at every 3 to 6 years or 5 to 10 if it's a longer. And they want to make a big impact because they're looking to move, right? They're not really looking to stay. And so they want to do something just innovative enough, just new enough that they get a lot of credit and it looks good, but not so new that it's risky. And infrastructure and funding things for the public good is really not sexy. Nobody comes and says, oh, look, they improve the infrastructure and they have 5 times the internet bandwidth they had a year before, and I'm going to hire them for that. No, they want to see you got this big grant, you did this innovative thing. And so to me, that was maybe not the most impactful, but the most important thing to look at is that we need people that are invested in the public good, not in getting that flashy impact that will get them their next job.
Hi. Is this on?
Yeah, you just have to hold it close.
Okay. I was on 2 of the discussions, but in both of them and also just in the debriefing and overall conversations, something struck me. The impetus for the aha moment was when I was on the panel number 8, yes, personalization. I went into that conversation thinking about plugins and scholars taking control of their own experience with links and content that they're getting to and creating an experience that's a little bit outside of what the library has controlled, and it may be a little bit more between a vendor platform and the individual scholar. So that was what I was thinking of. But one of the other people on the panel started talking about the way that law firms use this. Personalization, their goal is to reduce non-billable hours. It's important for them to make sure that they're being extremely efficient with their time and monetizing their time. So my aha moment was that we all come in with extremely different perspectives, and it's easy to be unintentionally bubbled in your views. So having these sorts of broad conversations that involve a lot of different people with different contexts, it really expands the understanding in an important way so that we can see the parts of the trend that we didn't necessarily know to respond to and that may be coming around to impact us. So my one specific example is, I think, just one of many sorts of examples that we should think of as we go into these conversations.
And so, hi, I'm Heather Staines. I'm a historian originally, and then I went into publishing, and now I work in the vendor space for a nonprofit. I participated in the discussion around content as a researcher and a historian. That was something that interested me. And the very first question that was asked at the table, and we were a mix between librarians and vendors, was, well, when did we start to call it content? And I was like, that's a good question. You know, has it lost its distinctiveness as a content type? Did we start to call it content because it's online and we're forcing it sort of into, you know, kind of homogeneous type, you know, deliverables? You know, some of the librarians at the table said they sort of felt like maybe it became this nameless, faceless content when it got too big for them to sort of control it or kind of act as a gatekeeper. And some of the images that came out of the day, I think Katina described it as a hurricane of content or a hurricane of information coming at us. And someone else suggested, you know, Mickey Mouse from Fantasia, where it's gotten, you know, kind of out of hand. So, you know, much in the same way, how do we approach things? Thinking about why we call content content was a new, you know, ponderable moment for me. And also, what is data, which I think is closely related to that. We had a variety of folks at the table. Charles Watkinson was saying that when at University of Michigan Publishing, when they go out to scholars in the humanities, in addition to wanting to publish their book or work on their website, they'll say, do you have data? And very quickly, you know, most of the scholars will go, no, I don't have data. I'm not a scientist, you know, I don't have spreadsheets and things like that. But when they talk a little bit more and tease it out, they do find that, of course, there's a lot of materials that the scholar prepared as part of the project that could well be beneficial to someone who's accessing the work later or wanting to kind of see the wider context of the work. And so really definitions of things and how they change across disciplines, as well as how they change over time, I thought that was a kind of an aha moment for me.
Anyone want to react to each other's? No pressure. Okay.
That wasn't one of the pre-scripted questions, so I just threw them a curveball, but I wanted them to get ready with it. No. So the next question I had is, if we see these some of these changes coming, what do you think librarians and publishers can do to better prepare for these changes so that we can benefit from them?
Okay, so going along with the theme from the discussion I was in, we felt that we need to talk more often and with more people at all levels about what should be information or resources that need to be in the common good. You know, it's nice that ProQuest picked up the occupational handbook, because otherwise it wouldn't exist anymore. But at the same time, it's behind a paywall. And this is not the fault of ProQuest, this is the fault of the government for dumping it. You know, the same thing with Trail. You know, everybody that wants access now has to pay for it. But if that one, I believe it was a university, hadn't decided that they would find a way to get funding for this and keep it up, this wouldn't exist. And you know, scientists have been contributing to that database for decades and decades, and the government has pretty much made their research reliant on that database and information from it and putting information into it. So if it didn't exist, we had like 30 people up in arms when that happened. And that's just at our one, you know, kind of medium, large size university. So these things have major impact. And so there needs to be wider discussions. And you know, it shouldn't be up to just, you know, this university picks up this thing, that one picks up that thing. Because then we're all doing separate fundraising. We all have to find staff time where these people could probably be doing other things for our campus. And what if there were like a nationwide or North American nonprofit for the public good, for libraries and information, and to have teams of people that could work on multiple, you know, data sets or databases or whatever it was that the disciplinary groups decided should be in the public good, and that could take that burden on, and they could do continuous fundraising, and maybe some funder would, you know, like to pay for this bell and whistle in this database, but the infrastructure would support all of these things, and it would be a lot more efficient and save us a lot of time, and maybe we could get more done. Because this idea that someone will pay for it, you know, that you'll get it paid for in your grant fees, well, not all grantors want to pay these fees. Who does it get passed on to? The scientist, and it's probably not the rock star scientist. It's probably the person making $50,000 a year that now has to pay $3,000 every time they publish. and maybe they need to publish 3 or 4 times a year or more to get tenure and keep their job. So, you know, the money is not coming from who people think it is. It's harming the person who is actually probably still paying on their graduate student loans.
That was a very impassioned plea. And now I'm going to be sort of very dull comparatively. So I was on, like I said, the personalization and the content discussions. And what occurred to me from being on those 2 discussions and just my general outlook is that we do need to have continued conversations with the various people who are likely to be involved in these trends. And for the trends we identified, I think that it involves educators, librarians, publishers, content providers, scholars, and I would like to see all, and maybe students too, I shouldn't exclude them, students as well, to have them in dialogues about the type of outcomes we're trying to reach. What are the goals? And how do we go about reaching them? But I really want librarians to be an active participant in these conversations because I can see that things could spin out of our control. Particularly with, let me imagine a personalization plugin on the extreme. Right now, for instance, if I have Copernio, which is free for users, the libraries don't have to have any involvement. The Copernio account could be a premium account if they want. The user can pay money for extra benefit. Well, imagine that next year they decide to have article recommender services because they can see the articles you're putting into the locker. And then they'll maybe do some RSS feeds from the journals that are ones you've been monitoring. And then maybe you can have it do some automatic searching. And then maybe add some features that are like in Anywhere Access where you've got your notes, it will do automatic citations, and it keeps expanding to become this very useful tool for our researchers that is completely separated from anything that we have necessarily influenced and could be more and more monetized. It could be, okay, well, instead of having to wait for interlibrary loan, if you find something you can't get, we'll get it for you for the low price of $12. So I think it's important that we continue to be very aware of the potential for this to spin out of our control through constant conversation with the people who are doing things that are interesting to us and to who we serve. And the other thing is that developing standards, I think, is a very good way forward to improve, particularly around the content. There's a large need for a new set of standards to talk about how we deal with the describing data, how do we ingest it into discovery layers, how do we preserve it. All of these will be improved if there's well thought out standards that involve the conversation with the people who are, well, all the people I've mentioned already need to have a stake in those.
This is me sitting here thinking that Athena's going to say everything that I was planning to say. The metadata issue is crucial, and I'm not telling anyone anything that they don't know, but it fits together with the idea of new types of content. I worked for briefly on discovery services and rights alignment when Ex Libris became part of ProQuest, and a lot of the content that was identified to be added to both the main ProQuest platform and also some of the archival products was what we would kind of describe as non-traditional content. It was image collections, is materials done out of museums and out of libraries. And when I would reach out to them and ask them, if they would be interested in having an agreement to include that in a broader amount of content, it would come down to metadata. One thing that more traditional publishers have gotten not 100% right, but have improved upon is standards and schemas around metadata. But non-traditional publishers or smaller publishers that one journal that's put forward by an academic or student publications don't have that capability at a push of a button to send out the metadata in a manner in which the library can or ProQuest or an aggregator can easily bring that in. And as we change what we think about content and data, I think it's only going to become a greater issue. One of the examples that I gave in the session when we were talking is I recently spent hours putting together a dedication page in the yearbook for my son who's a senior, and he's a music kid, and I wanted to include some pictures of him with his tuba. I thought, man, it would be so wonderful if I could just go to Facebook and say tuba and see, get the pictures that they would come up, because we don't have metadata for our personal images. And when I did find them, frequently they weren't high enough resolution to include in the ad anyway. But as these notions continue to expand, I think there's definitely a role for maybe a third-party service provider to add metadata. A lot of publishers and aggregators hire librarians to create metadata, but it's very, very time-consuming and fraught with peril if it's not done with precision. So I think metadata, fair data principles, all of that just becomes more critical.
Next year, 2 microphones. How about that?
Great. So I promised the panelists we'd give them a little bit of a break at this point from some of the prepared questions and give you've had a little bit of time to sort of soak in some of their reflections, and I think most of you have a copy of the blue sheet that was passed out. I'm out of them, but meet your neighbor if you don't have one, if you'd like, and I can put the short names for each of the trends up here on the screen. And we wanted to give you an opportunity, sort of as you've sort of marinated here in some of these trends or these ideas, or if not the specific ones here, you chose to spend your 1 to 2 p.m. today at Charleston in this room. What brought you to a session about trends? What are you thinking about with trends? So the floor is open to the community, because we really do want this to be a community process. Yes, and we will attempt to use the microphone, so, it has a long cord. This is good.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Penny Lockman from Willowbrook College. So in hearing you talk and looking at the list of trends, I'm actually going to combine 2 different things. We're talking about metadata, but then also on the list artificial intelligence. So I'm wondering if there was any discussion about the potential for artificial intelligence to do some metadata creation. So for example, if you have images and they're trying to use artificial intelligence to look at a picture and recognize a tuba, for example, or other things that could be used. And the potential for that as a way of creating metadata, but then also thinking about the quality control of that.
Interesting. So not only the panelists, but anyone who also was a participant, any conversations or thoughts or reactions to that idea? Or, yes, absolutely, come on, I'm gonna make you come up, because I think I can't get the mic all the way to you, but I know you, so. Go ahead.
That was a great question. Actually met Lisa showcasing exactly that. So I used to work in university libraries digitizing content, and that was the data scanners and doing it in a really, I guess, archaic way. And so what we do is we actually do leverage artificial intelligence so that you can take out your phone and take a picture of whatever you're writing or reading and essentially work to create metadata, create dynamic taxonomies and ontologies. So this is definitely possible. And we are here learning about how we can help libraries to do this so that you can access the knowledge you need when you need it. Specifically right now in the field of scientific research, but just broadly, what we've seen is this being useful. I used to have to manually tag, the content that I was, digitizing, and I found this to be very inefficient because I was limited by whatever knowledge that I had about whatever I was reading and any biases that I may have and didn't know. And so I believe artificial intelligence essentially removes those biases and as well as the limitations. So there's absolutely, it's being applied right now. And I'm very excited about continuing the conversation about how we can help libraries to do that. So great question. I'm here to learn.
Where are you from?
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, you can say who you are. I know, but not everyone does.
Thank you. So my name is Nicole Fish, and I'm the founder of Portfolio. And basically I took my experience in libraries and the efficiencies there and had a tech background as well, and combined those two to help to solve some of these problems across libraries as well as to the individual researchers themselves.
And so one of the things I kind of, if I could take, the question you ask of, so one of the things I find interesting these days is almost anytime you ask, has anyone blah, 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 like somebody else in the room is like, oh yes, either I'm doing this or somebody's doing this. So some of these things it's just hard to keep track of all the things that are happening. But what particularly I was thinking as you're talking about, this creation of metadata, in that now we've got like a whole nother piece of content, right? Because now we've also got the content that's the metadata, and it's the AI generated metadata versus human generated. And as inefficient as that was, it was like a miracle to have like digitized content with metadata. So how quickly we went from it's a miracle to it's archaic. Like, like wow, like these trends are coming at us fast. So, yeah. So other reflections or bringing these together. Yeah, great.
So several years ago, I was able to serve as one of the first librarian reviewers for Inspire, which is a higher energy physics database that the DOE provides partial funding for. It's actually kind of part of CERN as well, so it's an international project, but the people hours are paid for by the Department of Energy. And it was really interesting learning more about how this database came together. So they actually have a lot of automation. Most of the metadata is generated by their very fancy scripts and in the CERN cloud servers. But there's still a need for human intervention because there's things that are missing, there's things that are wrong. And so the reason that they still have people working on this is because those people are the ones fixing all that. And they're very, very responsive. They get thousands and thousands of error reports, and these people are the ones that go back in and they fix it, or they go, oh, hey, there's like a new term we need to add to the ontology because this is now branching out, and it was one area, but now it's split into even more subspecializations. So you can do a lot with automation, but as you have less and less people, that means that there's less and less people working on it. People need to be able to be sick or go on vacation. So I think that when I reviewed it, there was like one full-time person and I think 2 part-time people, or maybe 3 part-time people. That's not a very large group of people. So when there was a problem, it was harder for the people working on the project. So that's something to consider, and one reason why we might want to do more larger collaborative projects, even though they're harder to set up, because then you have more redundancy and people can actually be gone.
So I think when we talk about metadata, the first thing that people are likely to think of is descriptive subject metadata. But I think that I suspect there's a larger role for AI finding links or contextually relevant other documents, which is sort of a vacuum right now. If the author isn't in some way citing or presenting that here's my data set in my article, and right now there's no standard way of saying, here's the data set that I used and it's stored over there and you can go get it. It depends on the publication and how the author wants to mention their own data set. Or here are the other versions of my article, the preprint and so forth. I would think that Google has demonstrated that an algorithmic approach to identifying the same paper in different places works pretty well. I think it probably would work pretty well for contextually related other documents that aren't the same thing. So I'm hoping that AI can help solve that problem.
I just wanted to say that Inspire actually does that. It links the preprints with the postprints once they're out.
So what I think is absolutely critical is the perhaps machine-generated, human-curated aspect, and the importance of identifiers, which I think probably was brought up, in so many of the different discussions. I'm not from the sciences, I said I'm from history, so some of the things that come along, I think are pretty exciting. For reproducibility purposes across a number of the neuroscience field, they have these things called research resource identifiers, RRIDs. And they're typed into papers for reproducibility, so if you need to find out where a reagent was purchased or which particular stem cell line was used on an experiment, you will put the paper for each one of those items, you put the RRID for each one of those items in. So a group at University of California, San Diego made, we do Annotation of Hypothesis, they made an annotation account that would actually go to the external databases and pull up the information on each RRID and display it along the side of the page, so you didn't need to navigate away to have that information. They also added tags, so if you found a particularly relevant RRID, you could click on the tag for that one. It would show you all the other papers across all the other publishers that use that same element as part of the experiment. And you know, if there is a problem and an RRID doesn't resolve, there is a person that you can say, hey, this RRID doesn't resolve, or it's resolving to the wrong place, and there is a, you know, intervention that happens. And so we look at that as a model for a lot of potentially very, very valuable practices and initiatives that could be put into place.
Any other thoughts on this or related, other topics?
Other topics.
Great, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Charlotte Lair from Lyricist. So being a consortium, you know, you're talking about community engagement with all of this and how do we actually make an impact with that. I encourage all of you to engage your consortium, however many you belong to, with because you know we've done studies. 2 libraries belong to 2.5 consortia on average in the United States, and so you know consortia, at least you know at the leadership level, they're hungry for this and ways of helping you. You know, punch above your weight is what you hear lyricists say, but there's a lot of truth to that within the consortium community. They want to be in this space with you and to help you do that. So any ideas you get from this, I encourage you to expand that out.
I think that's a good point of, you know, when we're talking about very large trends coming at individual libraries, a lot of the challenges is that any given individual librarian or libraries or publisher or even platform is going to have a difficult time sort of buffering or capitalizing on a given trend at scale, right? So some of these questions of, you know, probably no given publisher can secure the scholarly record, right? But it seems pretty important to me that we secure the scholarly record, right? Away from being corrupted by either accident, but I mean, I think it's a little dystopian, but maybe not, to say that there could be people interested in you know, the cybersecurity threats to the scholarly record in a more malicious way as opposed to accidental. So we've talked about some errors that get introduced because of the ways that machine learning or AI might, and though I liked, Heather, your phrase, I've totally, like, machine generated, human curated, nice tagline there.
I didn't create it.
You didn't create it, all right, well,
Find out
we'll get
who
you to
did.
cite it with a footnote and a linked data later. But, you know, some of these other things, like if we can't count on the objects that we get as being the objects that they present themselves as being, a lot of this other stuff becomes even more pernicious, because if AI is doing its extraction on the base of a corrupted record, like this gets to be really difficult to untangle as well, right? Of where did that error come in, and what does maliciousness look like in this particular environment as well? I know that some of these questions have been raised in some of our sort of, let's say, at least less licit areas of dissemination of scholarly information, and whether these PDFs might have malware or other things injected into them. And that's not even as bad as the intellectual content being corrupted. So did I just prompt something? I feel like I just maybe introduce yourself,
Hi,
please.
I'm Stephen Rintup from Alexander Street. And I actually have a slightly different point, which is I've been looking at this common good dissolves one. And, you know, I'm older, and it just seems to me, I'm really in question. I get who we've got in the White House, and I get that there's a lot of defunding going on, but at the same time, I look at, you know, the fantastic spread of things like GitHub that suddenly allow code to be enormously distributed. In Europe, the creation of Europeana, here in the States, the creation of DPLA. And I just wonder if there's more detail there around, is the common good really dissolving, or has perhaps technology enabled the common good to thrive more than it did, say, 20 years ago? Silence.
Good question. Yeah, I mean, none of these trends can definitely be challenged and interpreted, so go for it.
So we talked a lot about this on both sides. If you look at the funding of libraries, or say the institution that I'm from, you know, our budget for our institution is somewhere around 1.2, 1.3 billion. Only 200,000 or so of that, maybe 250,000, comes from state. So the rest of that is coming from other sources. So, you know, that's really like a minuscule amount of our huge, huge budget, right? Maybe it's 200 million. But anyways, it's small compared to the whole. And if you look at the budget for the library that I work at, the only raise in funding, and they've had many rounds of cuts over the last 20 to 30 years, was we got a couple dollars more per student credit hour fee to try and pay for the inflation on the resources. So public libraries have also faced this. I remember when I was in school in the 80s, my public library was only open 2.5 days a week. I couldn't really use it for most of my schoolwork because I couldn't even get there in the hours that they were open. So we have seen a downward trend of a lot of things. Because again, these are not the sexy things, right? Like the tech is sexy. People like tech. But then there are things like the open access resources like textbooks. But actually, someone was saying that the biggest user of the open access textbooks are actually for-profit colleges and universities, because they're trying to keep their bottom line and their profits as high as possible. And someone asked the question, is this bad or is this good? Maybe it's neither, right? That is probably overall good if people eventually move to them, and it's not just the for-profits. It doesn't really necessarily hurt anything that the for-profits are using them. So, you know, it's kind of this dichotomy, but it's like social services. You know, it's like people are like, there's this funding level, right? And we've increased it to this much. But if you're one of those people who has no access, who isn't benefiting, makes that $1 more than they can get benefits, and now they're just like couch surfing because they have no money, and they're supposedly making 20 or 30,000, but they're living on people's couches, you don't really feel like things have improved, right? And so if you look at like wage gaps for women and minorities, when women are minorities and other things, they haven't really improved. So I don't think that the common good has improved. I feel like in certain niche spots that are popular, it's improved. But in the others, it's the same or it's worse.
So I think if I can I want to draw a connection here, which is one of the things that we can see is if certain parts of the common good are dissolving, right, there's also the fact that people can say that is not desirable and seek to put new things into place, which I think maybe is what we can sort of see in an attempt to basically sort of, if you will, subvert a trend in order to at least stop it, or even better in some cases, probably move it in a different direction. So I think it's really good for us to never, I mean, the reality is we're making things very simple in order to discuss them in a 2-hour lab and a 1-hour meeting, but there's a lot of complexity here that we want to bring out, which is why we do it as discussions and not little talks. So Heather, you want to respect or reflect on this too?
Sorry, respect. Please respect her too, but.
Yeah, I didn't participate in the common good chat, but now in retrospect, I'm wishing that I had. But one trend, which is much broader than just our space, is deferred maintenance on everything. It takes longer for me to get from Bridgeport to Grand Central Station now than it did when I commuted 6 years ago because of the tracks. Can't tolerate the trains going at the speed that they're supposed to go. And I did my graduate work at Yale, and there were decades and decades of deferred maintenance. Somebody fell through a hole in the law school auditorium floor because it had been covered with a rug, and then gradually, as more people went through, the rug got closer and closer, and when the rug edge met the edge of the hole, the next person that stood on it, went. Fortunately, it wasn't like a big drop, but it was, in the law school, you think you'd want to watch out for that. But one of the sad things that I'm thinking about here with the common good, and definitely not the saddest thing I've seen on TV because we're just bombarded every day, is when the Brazilian National Museum burned to the ground, and not just the artifacts, but the work of the scholars. And I visited the British Museum a few weeks later because I'm like a museum enthusiast, and they were talking about how they have so many artifacts that they could never display them all. And I said, I really hope that every museum in the world that has artifacts related to Brazil will be in touch with them to try to recreate, because there's talks about like they're going to recreate it virtually, and you could like virtually walk through the museum, and that's wonderful if you can't go. But you do hope that museums would step up and do that, and it does say, you know, our collective good, not just as a country or community, but as a species, kind of depends on it. But sorry, it's a bit preachy. But.
It occurs to me that there's different types of public good, and we're talking about different things when we're talking about GitHub or Wikipedia or you know, Flickr, which is with all the CC attribute images that people can use for free. There's all these things that we've created as civilizations around the world, but they're sort of on commercial sites ultimately. They are not owned in a public sense. They were created in a public sense. They're usable in a public sense, but that infrastructure that they're on is not the public-owned public good, not in the same way that a museum is or the roads are. I think that may be the distinction that's going on here. There's a lot of wonderful things being created for everyone right now, but it's not being funded by the government.
Yeah, really helpful to tease these things apart. Anyone else want to add to our discussion or reflections on this?
Just easier for everyone to hear. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Lev Rickards. I'm early career at Santa Clara University. So because of that, I'm asking a question that doesn't make sense. One of the comments earlier was about AI and machine learning. At our institution on the front of house, you see more technology sort of coming in around search and discovery, but that's pushed our librarians to be more engaged in instruction and information literacy. So it seems to have been a fairly natural and appropriate response. I'm wondering what that looks like on the acquisition collections. Where are we being pushed, maybe ultimately for good, because some of our functions are being ceded to machine learning?
Interesting question. I'm looking at Athena because I'm thinking, isn't this your job?
Okay. I'm not sure that I fully grasp what you're asking. You're saying that because of AI, how is AI going to impact how I'm selecting or acquiring things?
I'm not even specifically talking about AI, but just as tech comes in, maybe before we said, well, students need librarians to find things.
Okay.
And now we found a new role for reference, like for liaisons and instruction.
What's your new role?
Actually, I feel like we haven't ceded acquisitions decisions to AI quite. I mean, we kind of did with the approval plans. I don't remember if anyone remembers several years ago, it seems like 15, 20 years ago, there was the big debate about using approval plans. If we're all using the same approval plan at all these different universities, we end up with the same collection everywhere. And then it hasn't really quite happened that way, I don't think, but it was a big concern. And now we've got the big deals, so the journal collections at a lot of the universities that can afford the big deals are pretty much the same. And unless you've got different archives and so forth, and smaller publishers. And we've got PDAs and evidence-based selection. So instead of the librarian making the decision about what's going to be purchased, the users are. So those are different ways that the collection or bibliographic librarians have sort of ceded some of that selection. But I know for me, I do select for an area, and I'm the electronic resources librarian. I feel like I go in and I know those other things exist, and it's freed me up to dig into the stuff that's not necessarily being asked for, or the stuff that I know is needed by a niche group, or I know that the niche group is the one who have the role of selector for their department, so I need to balance that. So I don't think our role has gone away. I do think, though, that recommender services from AIs or intelligent systems could be extremely helpful. They maybe could help me find things that I wouldn't have known to look for. I think part of the problem is, though, we are using services like Gobi or similar book agents or journal agents, and they have to know about this content in order for me to discover it. Or I maybe will find it on Amazon, but whatever's missing from the very large sets that we're selecting from, I don't know how I find out about those. Those are the harder things.
So we dumped our approval plan because we had major problems with not just the content, but with our provider. And so we haven't had an approval plan for quite a while. But part of the reason that we had to dump it for budget reasons was because we needed to stick within a certain budget, and they weren't doing that. And the reason we had to stick within a very narrow budget is we don't have a lot of money for things that are not subscriptions. And so most of our money for non-subscription items comes from our endowment. So there's an endowment that's specifically for the library under the university. And so, you know, like my budget for my areas, of which I have 7, one of which is water, which is huge, is around $10,000 this year. That's not very much money. We have a separate pot of money that we buy things on demand from patrons, like they request it through interlibrary loan, and if it meets certain criteria, we'll just buy it for them instead, with a preference toward E if they like or prefer E. But it's really not that much money, and a lot of people I talk to have like $5,000 for one department or for 5. And in the sciences, that might buy you 10 books, right? Like that's really not that much money. Fortunately, in chemistry and physics, we're not really into books unless someone is changing their area of research or you get someone new. So it's not as much of an issue, and of course we have some book packages that we buy. But there isn't really that much option to do a selection. I don't consider it, you know, collection development when I have such a small amount of money. You know, the one year that I had, someone had died and left us $60,000 for chemistry, I could go do collection development. But when I have $10,000 for 6 different areas, I'm not doing collection development. I'm just trying to make sure that I have enough to buy what people need to do their research or to take their classes. And if I have anything left over, I'm trying to cobble it together with other people's funds to buy small back files that will help reduce the cost, that will help us not have to make cuts because of inflation. So I think collection development is a very interesting question.
Oh, did you have something? I can add something on kind of the publishing side.
So in a kind of related area, publishers are talking about how they might use artificial intelligence as a substitute for or to facilitate peer review. But I think we've all heard, you know, I think there's every editorial assistant or assistant editor in the world would like to not spend all their time trying to find peer reviewers and to chase peer reviewers, but we've all heard about there not being an adequate representation of women amongst peer reviewers, there not being an adequate proportion globally representing the percentage of the sciences. So if we're going to use AI to find peer reviewers, it's probably, you know, as with other data sets, it's going to replicate the problems that we already have, so we would really need to look at that. There's also a lot of discussion around using AI to find connections between articles, whether it's recommending or if it's for practical purposes. There's a tool called Meta that was acquired by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative a few years back that, you know, they're hoping it's going to be part of their, you know, Cure All Diseases initiative and the like. But I'm a little bit, I love technology, but I'm a little bit skeptical if the thought is we're going to turn that discovery process over exclusively to AI.
So I feel like one of the trends that I'll remember to put in next year, but I hope one of you will do it instead, will be, like I feel like there's 2 versions of what we're talking about here, one of which is sort of the negative version of this is it's all getting consolidated, and the other one is that's what lets us scale, right? I mean, so scale at some level demands consolidation in certain ways, but maybe there's better and worse ways to do consolidation that enable us to attain economies of scale and attain those kind of corpus that let us do some of the AI and things, but at the same time some of the challenges of that is that we worry then about what disappears, right, when you have that kind of, well, the one version of scale is homogenization. And so how do we maintain heterogeneity and diversity and some of those other things? So I think what this tells us is that our field is really just, there's so many different trends we could be talking about. So one of the things that I really wanted to make sure we didn't do with the trend spotting initiative was to declare like these are the 5 important trends and you should ignore all the rest of them. So much as, in some ways what I would like us, my personal sort of passion for doing this is I think this is actually more about developing sort of like muscle memory or mindset about how we're looking at our work and understanding that what's ever happening on the desk or on the screen right in front of us is being driven by a lot of forces, and some of them are external to the library or to the publisher. Some of them are ways that we're responding to some of those forces. Trends are not all good, they're not all bad, and sort of my other quip here is the future is not inevitable. A future, I hope, is inevitable, but a particular future is going to be made up of decisions that we make today, and the next today, and the next today, right? So I personally find this very empowering, even if sometimes it seems a little doom and gloom and dystopian to be like, oh, how could we ever, but you can't organize against something that you haven't identified. And so to the degree that we're seeing things we don't like, being able to see them, describe them, analyze them, that is where some of the power then comes from to be like, no, we want something different than this. But there are also cases where we can say, this is actually really great. Honestly, somebody please make a better APA MLA Chicago citation system. I am all in on that. Please, immediately. Right? So some of these technologies, I would love for those problems to no longer be I'm a journal editor. I spend way too much time in the Chicago Manual of Style. I know. I edit a journal that is published in by librarians, and librarians teach other people how to do citation. And yet, okay. So I think we've actually covered some of these things already. So I'm gonna say, I want to ask one last question here, which is what do you, we've heard a lot today about, some of these different things. So what do you think ultimately is the best way for us to keep these conversations going? That was kind of my last question to you all. How should we keep these conversations going? And how do we broaden them so that we don't talk within our silos?
Oh, that's a tough question.
You didn't think we were getting to the last question?
I did write
No.
something, but
Okay.
obviously we need to partner with people at a lot of different levels. And I think that means expanding the conversation beyond the Charleston conference. I think it's a good home to bring it all together and sum it up yearly, but I would love to see this conversation happening at Midwinter and at publishers conferences and ACRL and in public libraries and just any space that we have someone that's going to that we could get them to host a conversation. I think that gathering of information, that sharing of perspectives and bringing it all back together once a year and maybe having a longer Trend Lab next year. I hate to suggest longer meetings because I'm pretty anti-long meetings, but in this case I think if we had 3 hours with a nice 30-minute break in the middle so that we could talk longer, because I think we all felt like we were just getting a handle on what we were talking about and kind of coming to an agreement, and then it was done and we had places to be.
I second the more time for the brainstorming. It was so much fun, and I enjoyed the conversation so much that I would have liked to have been able to go to each table and eavesdrop. But how do we keep this going and expand our perspective? I know that other industries do similar things. I think there are trend spotters out there that try and track trends, and I think that'd be an important thing to keep track of. I'm thinking of EDUCAUSE and ECAR. I know they publish trend information with some regularity, and of course Pew Research Center. And I'm sure there's others that I don't know of, but finding out who those trend spotters are and keeping up with what they are talking about could be very helpful for us and either getting new perspectives on the trends we know about or understanding new trends.
Yeah, I second the trying to get the word out beyond just Charleston. And those of you who know me know I love to put together programming. I have a joke where I say there are two types of people in the world: people who've been on a panel for me and people who have not yet been a panel for me. So you know where you fall. But I think you know, looking at calls for proposals and things would be a great start. I also think it would be wonderful if we were able to use a listserv or the Charleston listserv for when we find articles and links that we think would be beneficial to discuss, that we could kind of share those around. And maybe even, I don't know if there needs to be like a working group for each trend, because while they overlap and you know, there's too many of them, but if there were folks who wanted to keep the conversation going on a monthly basis or every 2-month basis, if we set up a call that video call or something where folks could kind of just join and, you know, what are you thinking now, that might help to bring in the voices of people who can't necessarily come, you know, to a physical conference, or who watch the videos later and get interested. So just some ideas, I think, of how we could continue to grow the movement.
Excellent. I didn't give her any hint of how to do this, but I think what this really did was set up very nicely for me to invite you all to consider being part of this conversation moving forward. So if you were not part of the Trend Lab on Monday and you're interested in at least knowing about what will happen in the coming months, please make sure you either email me or drop me your card or write your name on a piece of paper or something, because we'll start building our list of who will get notifications and the like for the coming year. But if you are, also, as I said, we're not saying that you had to have been at the Trend Lab to start contributing to our trend texts, which so far what I'm hearing is people really love this, and every single person I run into in the hallway is like, hey, we can do a book, we can do it, and I'm like, who's the we? I mean, the goal here is a community engaged process, not a Lisa driven process. So I really love this kind of enthusiasm. As I was listening, I was like, oh, we could do like a trends toolkit. Like, you want to host a trend lab at your conference? You know, here's the way to do it. Like, here's some guidelines. Not that you have to follow the rules, but it would give people a chance to get started. But I really encourage you to think, if you were here today and I heard so many great ideas, whether it's one of the trends we did discuss or another trend that you want to bring to the table for discussion or reflections on them, or bringing a couple together. These trend texts are intended to be really short essays, like 500 to 750 words. Like, that's not long, right? Not long at all. We welcome longer, but just to be clear, like, the goal here isn't that you write a monograph. The goal is like that you write like a long blog post. And we're playing around with whether they'll just be blog posts, or maybe they would be a column in Against the Grain, or maybe they'll be a special issue. So please, thoughts on that as well. I'm putting up my contact information here. That's an L as in L Janicki. Identifiers are forever, so there's my maiden name. I'm also Lisa Librarian at Gmail, Twitter, Facebook, all those sorts of things. Be happy to hear from you, questions, comments, suggestions, or if you are interested in authoring one of those trend texts, either as a single author or collaboratively, I'd love to hear from you. So I know we're going to wrap up just a few minutes early, but I don't think anyone ever bothered by that, especially since I do want to have time for anyone who might want to talk to one of our panelists one-on-one. I want to thank them in particular because they had to agree to be on this panel without being ever at the Trend Lab first. So they took a big risk here, and so I want to thank all of them for stepping up in that role.